The wind sweeping across the tarmac at Fort Stryker, Colorado, carried the bitter bite of early November. It was Veterans Day, and the base was practically vibrating with the manufactured patriotism of an open house event. Banners snapped in the crosswinds. Polished brass caught the morning sun, and the smell of hot dogs from the commissary tents mingled heavily with the sharp, metallic scent of gun oil and cordite from the exhibition ranges. Captain Elias Vance stood near the edge of the VIP bleachers, a styrofoam cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. At 36, Vance was a military intelligence officer whose brain was hardwired to find the anomaly in any given picture. He wasn't here to watch the infantry boys show off their shiny toys to the civilian crowds. He was here because crowds brought chaos, and chaos was a breeding ground for security threats. His dark eyes tracked over the sea of faces, the awestruck kids, the proud parents, the local politicians shaking hands for the cameras. Standard baseline, normalcy. And then, his gaze snagged on a tear in the canvas of reality. She was standing near the back of the Sector 4 firing range, where the 500-yard targets were set up. To the untrained eye, she was just another tragic statistic of the American failure. A homeless woman who had wandered onto the base seeking warmth or a free meal. Her olive-drab surplus jacket was stained with streaked grime and hung off her skeletal frame like a tent. Her cargo pants were frayed, and her combat boots were wrapped in gray duct tape. Her hair was a matted nest hidden beneath a pulled-down beanie. But Vance wasn't looking at her clothes. He was an intelligence officer. He looked at behavioral micro-expressions and biomechanics. Anomaly 1, Vance thought, taking a slow sip of his coffee. She isn't shivering. It was 40 degrees out, the wind chill cutting through standard winter gear. Yet her posture was perfectly relaxed. No hunched shoulders, no chattering teeth. Anomaly 2, her spatial awareness. She wasn't gawking at the weapons displays or the soldiers. Her eyes, a piercing, icy gray barely visible beneath her hat, were performing a systematic quadrant scan. She was cataloging exits, identifying choke points, and noting the positions of the armed military police. It was the automatic, ingrained habit of someone who had spent years in high-threat environments. Anomaly 3, her stance. Most people standing in a crowd shift their weight from leg to leg. They slouch. This woman was perfectly balanced. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, center of gravity anchored. It was a tactical readiness stance. If someone threw a punch or a flashbang went off, she wouldn't stumble. She would neutralize or evade. "Who are you?" Vance wondered, his pulse ticking up a notch. The detective in him was entirely awake now. Before Vance could move to intercept and casually question her, the peace of the morning was shattered by a booming, amplified voice. "All right, folks, gather around the barricades. Let's show you what modern American precision looks like." Lieutenant Jackson Pierce strode to the center of the firing line, practically glowing with self-importance. Pierce was 27, built like a fitness model, and had an ego that entered the room 5 minutes before he did. He was a garrison soldier. His uniform was pressed with razor-sharp creases. His boots shone like mirrors, and the only sand he had ever seen was on the volleyball courts at Coronado. He had 0 combat deployments, a fact he compensated for by being obnoxiously loud and demanding strict adherence to protocol. Today, Pierce announced to the gathering crowd, "My instructors and I will demonstrate engaging targets at 300 and 500 yards. This takes years of elite conditioning. It is not for the faint of heart." Sergeant Miller, Pierce's loyal shadow and enabler, chuckled from the side. Miller nudged Pierce and pointed a thumb toward the back of the crowd. "Hey, LT," Miller sneered, his voice carrying over the wind. "Looks like someone from downtown wandered off the bus. Think she wants to critique our groupings?" Hundreds of heads turned. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving the homeless woman entirely isolated. Phones immediately went up, camera lenses focusing on her grimy clothes. The civilian crowd murmured, a mix of uncomfortable pity and mild disgust. Pierce's sculpted smile vanished, replaced by an expression of profound irritation. He marched toward her, his boots striking the asphalt with heavy, intimidating thuds. He stopped just 2 feet away from her, invading her personal space, a classic dominance play. "Ma'am," Pierce said, The word dripping with condescension. This is a restricted exhibition area for invited guests and verified veterans. The Salvation Army shelter is 3 miles down Interstate 25. I suggest you turn around and start walking before I have MPs escort you out for trespassing. Vance put his coffee down on a nearby crate. He started walking toward the confrontation, his mind racing. Look at her hands, Vance thought as he closed the distance. Look at the calluses. The woman didn't flinch at Pierce's aggression. She didn't shrink away. Slowly, with deliberate, non-threatening movements that telegraphed perfectly so as not to startle an armed man. She reached into the inner pocket of her ruined jacket. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, laminated and worn at the edges. A DD-214. The official Department of Defense certificate of release or discharge from active duty. She held it out. Her hand didn't shake. Pierce didn't even look at it. He swatted her hand away. I can print one of those off the internet in 5 minutes. You smell like an alleyway. Lady, you're scaring the families. Move, now. I want to participate in the open call shoot, she said. Her voice stopped Vance in his tracks. It wasn't the raspy, broken voice of a street vagrant. It was terrifyingly calm. It was the cold, flat, deadpan tone of a heart monitor that had flatlined. It was a voice devoid of ego, fear, or emotion. Pierce blinked, taken aback, and then burst into cruel, theatrical laughter. He turned to the crowd, playing to his audience. You hear that? She wants to shoot. Lady, the recoil of an M4 would snap your collarbone. Have you eaten anything this week besides dumpster scraps? A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Several older veterans shifted uncomfortably, their faces tightening at the blatant disrespect. Lieutenant, Vance said quietly, stepping into the circle. Stand down. She presented her papers. Pierce stiffened. Captain Vance, with respect. Sir, I am running this range. I have a standard of excellence to maintain. I am not turning my firing line into a charity circus. He turned back to the woman, his eyes narrowing with a malicious glint. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted to break whatever quiet dignity she was holding onto. You want to shoot? Pierce challenged, gesturing to a beat-up, standard-issue M4 carbine resting on a nearby table. Fine, let's make a wager. You hit a single target at 100 yards. Just one. You do that, I'll let you stay and I'll personally buy you a hot steak dinner at the officers' club. But when you miss, and you will miss, you walk off my base and never come back. Deal? Vance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado wind. He looked at the woman. He looked at her hands again. The webbing between her thumb and index finger was thickened. The knuckles bore tiny, faded starburst scars, shrapnel. Make it the 500-yard targets, she said quietly. The silence that fell over the range was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. 500 yards with a standard red dot sight. No magnification. And a crosswind? Most regular infantry would struggle to land a body shot. Pierce's face flushed red with anger. Give her the weapon, he snapped at Sergeant Miller. Let her make a fool of herself. Miller grabbed the M4, verified it was clear, and shoved it toward her. Don't shoot your own foot, Grandma. What happened next would be analyzed by Captain Elias Vance in his sleep for the rest of his life. The moment her fingers wrapped around the polymer grip of the rifle, the homeless woman vanished. The physical transformation was so rapid, so biomechanically flawless. It was like watching a predator shed its disguise. She didn't just hold the weapon, she became an extension of it. She dropped her center of gravity, indexing her cheek to the stock with millimeter precision. Her support hand didn't grip the barrel conventionally, she used a modified C-clamp grip. Her thumb driving the muzzle down to manage recoil before it even happened. God Almighty, Vance thought, his breath catching in his throat. That's a Tier 1 operational stance. That's JSOC. Whenever you're ready to miss, Pierce mocked, pulling out a stopwatch. She didn't close her left eye. She kept both eyes open, a technique used exclusively for maintaining maximum peripheral situational awareness in a hot combat zone. She breathed in. The wind whipped her ragged jacket. She exhaled, pausing at the exact natural respiratory pause where the human body is perfectly still. Crack. The sound of the shot echoed off the distant hills. 3 seconds later, The metallic ping of a confirmed hit on a steel plate 500 yards away rang out. Before Pierce could even open his mouth, she transitioned. It wasn't a sweep, it was a snap. Her muzzle snapped 20 degrees to the right. Crack, ping. Crack, ping. Crack, ping. 15 rounds. 15 seconds. 15 targets spread across a 500-yard expanse in a shifting crosswind. Every single one rang out with a sickeningly perfect center mass hit. The rhythm of her shots was a mechanical, lethal metronome. It was an execution. She lowered the rifle, engaged the safety with a flick of her thumb, and placed it gently on the table. She turned to look at Pierce, whose mouth was hanging open, his face drained of all blood. "Targets cleared, Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Where is my stake?" In the dead silence of the crowd, Captain Elias Vance pulled out his encrypted military phone. His hands were actually shaking. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know the tragedy that had driven her to the streets, or the ghosts she carried. But looking at the cold, dead perfection in her eyes, Vance knew one thing for absolute certain. Fort Stryker hadn't just been visited by a homeless veteran. They had just been visited by the Angel of Death. And Vance was going to find out exactly which graveyard she had crawled out of. The ringing of the final steel plate seemed to hang in the frigid Colorado air for an eternity. 15 rounds, 15 hits, 500 yards. In the world of long-range ballistics, what the crowd had just witnessed wasn't just improbable, it defied the fundamental physics of a standard issue. Unmagnified M4 carbine. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound on Sector 4 was the wind whipping the nylon flags. Lieutenant Jackson Pierce stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. His perfectly curated reality, a world where he was the apex predator and this grimy, broken woman was the prey, had just violently shattered. Cognitive dissonance washed over his face. He looked at the smoking barrel of the rifle on the table, then at the distant targets, and finally at her. "Trick," Pierce stammered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its previous theatrical boom. That's a trick. The optics are rigged. You've got someone downrange." It was a pathetic, desperate excuse, and everyone knew it. Sergeant Miller, who had handed her the weapon, took a slow, involuntary step away from Pierce. Even Miller wasn't foolish enough to deny the lethal poetry they had just watched. A few feet away, Captain Elias Vance wasn't looking at the targets. He was already moving. He slid his encrypted tablet from his tactical vest, his thumbs flying across the biometric interface. He bypassed the standard base security firewalls, accessing the SIPRNet, the Department of Defense's classified network. "Who the hell are you?" Vance's mind raced as he typed. He had caught a glimpse of the name on the laminated DD-214 before Pierce had swatted it away. "Quinn, Valerie Quinn." Vance punched the name into the Joint Personnel Adjudication System. The loading icon spun for exactly 3 seconds before the screen flashed crimson. "Access denied. Clearance level. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information required." Vance's breath hitched. A standard infantry discharge wouldn't throw a red flag. Not even a Ranger or standard Special Forces file would lock down like this. A completely black flagged file meant one of two things. The person was a highly dangerous traitor, or they were a ghost, an operator whose missions were so deeply buried in the Pentagon's black budget that their very existence was classified as a state secret. Vance tapped a secondary override, utilizing his commanding officer's emergency intelligence clearance. He had 30 seconds before the NSA flagged his search. The file cracked open. It was 90% heavy black redactions, like a document violently crossed out with a marker. But what Vance could read made his blood run cold. Valerie Quinn, Master Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, MARSIC, Critical Skills Operator. Call sign, Wraith 9. Vance stared at the screen, the noise of the crowd fading into static. Every intelligence officer, every sniper instructor in the armed forces knew the campfire legend of Wraith 9. She was the Phantom who had provided overwatch during the disastrous Operation Red Valley in Afghanistan 4 years ago, when a convoy of 50 Marines was ambushed and pinned down in a kill zone. Wraith 9 had taken a highly exposed position on a ridgeline. She held off a numerically superior enemy force for 14 continuous hours. The official after-action reports were scrubbed, but the whispers in the intel community said she had taken 3 bullet wounds and localized shrapnel damage. Yet never stopped firing. She saved 38 men that day. 12, however, came home in flag-draped transfer cases. And after that mission, after receiving the Navy Cross in a closed-door, highly classified ceremony, Wraith 9 had vanished into the civilian world, shattered by the weight of the 12 she couldn't save. Vance looked up from his tablet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The legendary Wraith 9 wasn't a myth. She was standing 20 yards away from him, wearing duct-taped boots, shivering in a filthy surplus jacket. "You're a fraud." Pierce's voice suddenly spiked, shrill and panicked. He was losing control of the crowd, losing his dignity, and his fragile ego couldn't handle it. "I don't know what kind of carnival trick you pulled, you junkie, but you are done making a mockery of my range." Pierce lunged forward. It was a stupid, emotional, untrained move. He reached out to grab her by the shoulder to physically forcefully march her off the firing line. "Pierce, no, stand down," Vance barked, dropping his tablet and sprinting forward. He knew what happened when you startled a severe PTSD combat veteran with physical aggression. But Vance was too late. The moment Pierce's gloved hand clamped onto her shoulder, Valerie Quinn didn't flinch. Her reaction was entirely autonomic, a deeply ingrained, subconscious combat reflex, in a blur of motion too fast for the civilian phones to capture. She dropped her weight, pivoted her hips, and trapped Pierce's wrist. She executed a flawless, brutal wrist lock and leveraged her forearm against his elbow joint. With a sickeningly precise twist, she drove the physically imposing lieutenant straight to the asphalt. Pierce hit the ground with a heavy thud, letting out a sharp yelp of pain as his face slammed into the concrete. Valerie stood over him, her knee hovering just an inch from his neck, her grip holding his arm at an angle that promised to snap the bone if he breathed wrong. The crowd gasped. Several people screamed. The military police stationed at the perimeter unholstered their weapons, shouting commands. "MPs, weapons down, weapons down. That is an order," Vance roared, flashing his captain's bars and placing his body between the MPs and Valerie. He slowly turned to her, keeping his hands raised, palms open. "Valerie," Vance said, his voice soft, steady, projecting absolute calm, "you are safe. The threat is neutralized. Let him go." During the scuffle, the oversized, torn collar of her jacket had been violently yanked to the side, ripping the frayed fabric of the t-shirt beneath it. The tear exposed her left collarbone and upper shoulder. And there, stark against her pale, scarred skin, was the ink. It wasn't a standard, flashy military tattoo. It was a memorial. At the center was a shattered hourglass over a sniper's crosshairs, the unofficial emblem of the Marsic ghost units. But it was the imagery surrounding it that brought a sudden, suffocating silence to the veterans in the crowd. There were 38 small, intricately detailed gold stars tattooed across her shoulder. Below them, clustered close to her heart, were 12 stars completely blacked out, the weight of the dead, permanently etched into her flesh. "My God," an older man in the crowd, a Vietnam veteran wearing a faded cavalry hat, whispered, taking off his hat and pressing it to his chest. He understood. He knew exactly what those black stars meant. "Let me go, you psycho," Pierce whined from the ground, his face pale with pain and humiliation. "Lieutenant Pierce, if you speak one more word, I will personally court-martial you for assaulting a decorated superior officer." The voice didn't come from Vance. It rolled across the tarmac like a low rumble of thunder. The crowd parted respectfully, almost fearfully, as a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair and 3 gleaming stars on his collar stepped onto the firing line. Base Commander, Lieutenant General Arthur Sterling. Sterling didn't look at the bleeding lieutenant on the ground. He didn't look at the crowd. His weathered eyes, framed by deep lines of command and sorrow, were fixed solely on the homeless woman. Sterling had been the commanding officer of Special Operations Command 4 years ago. He was the man who had pinned the Navy Cross on her chest before she disappeared. Valerie looked up. For a fraction of a second, The cold, deadpan mask of the street survivor cracked. A flicker of profound, agonizing exhaustion washed over her icy eyes. Slowly, she released Pierce's arm and stepped back, her posture returning to that defensive, hunched state. She pulled her torn jacket tightly around her neck, hiding the stars, hiding her shame. "Sir," she whispered, the word barely carrying over the wind. General Sterling stopped 3 feet from her. He ignored the stench of the streets, ignored the dirt, and ignored the cameras. He slowly, deliberately, brought his hand up to a razor-sharp salute. It was the kind of salute a general gives only to a Medal of Honor recipient or a fallen hero. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Quinn," Sterling said, his voice thick with an emotion he was fighting to control. "I have had teams looking for you for 3 years. We thought we lost you to the streets." The crowd was absolutely dead silent. The phones were still recording. But nobody moved. The arrogant Lieutenant Pierce, who had scrambled to his knees, was now staring at Sterling in sheer, unadulterated horror. He had just challenged, mocked, and assaulted a master gunnery sergeant who commanded the respect of a 3-star general. His military career was effectively, instantly, dead. "I am lost, General," Valerie replied, her gaze dropping to the concrete. "Wraith 9 died in the Red Valley. There's nothing left but a ghost." "Ghosts," Sterling said gently, stepping closer and lowering his voice so only she and Vance could hear. "Don't shoot 15 for 15 in a crosswind. You're still in there, Val, and thank God for that." Vance watched the exchange, his analytical mind piecing the puzzle together. He saw the general's desperation. A base commander didn't just stumble onto an open-house shooting range unless there was a crisis. Sterling had come looking for her. "Sir," Vance interrupted softly, stepping to the general's side. "With respect, why were you looking for her?" General Sterling looked at Vance, then back to Valerie. The sorrow in his eyes hardened into cold, operational steel. "Because 72 hours ago, an encrypted distress signal bounced off a satellite over the Syrian border," Sterling said, the words falling like lead weights. "A Black Ops extraction team went down behind enemy lines. 5 men, the Red Valley survivors." Valerie's head snapped up. The deadness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent spark of terror. "No," she breathed. They were supposed to be stateside. They got redeployed, Val, and now they are surrounded in a hostile valley, running out of ammo, waiting for an execution squad. We can't send conventional air support without triggering an international incident." Sterling paused, the weight of the world resting on his shoulders. "They need an overwatch. They need a miracle." He looked at the grimy, broken woman in front of him. "They need Wraith 9. The spectacle on Sector 4 dissolved into a highly coordinated military blackout in less than 3 minutes. General Sterling didn't shout. He didn't have to. A single, sharp gesture to the perimeter guards was all it took. The military police formed an impenetrable human wall around Valerie Quinn, shielding her from the sea of civilian smartphone cameras. Captain Elias Vance fell in step right behind her, his intelligence operative instincts fully engaged. He was scanning the crowd, memorizing faces, ensuring no one got too close. As for Lieutenant Jackson Pierce, he was left kneeling on the cold asphalt, nursing a deeply bruised wrist and a shattered ego. 2 heavily armed MPs stood over him, their expressions devoid of sympathy. "Lieutenant Pierce," General Sterling's voice cut through the wind one last time, freezing the young officer to his core. "Report to my adjutant's office. Strip your rank insignia. And wait. You're done here." Pierce didn't argue. He couldn't. He just watched in pale, shivering silence as the homeless woman he had mocked was escorted away like royalty, flanked by the highest-ranking men on Fort Stryker. They moved quickly to a nondescript black SUV waiting behind the VIP tents. The drive to the base's underground command center was completed in heavy, suffocating silence. Valerie sat in the backseat, staring out the tinted window. The adrenaline from the firing line was fading, and Vance could see the violent tremors returning to her hands. The withdrawal from the streets. The sensory overload of being thrust back into the military machine. It was tearing at her frayed nerves. She pulled her tattered, foul-smelling jacket tighter around herself. A futile attempt to build a wall between her and the ghost Sterling had just summoned. 15 minutes later, the heavy steel doors of a SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, hissed shut behind them, sealing them 50 feet underground. The room was sterile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, and smelled of ozone and hot electronics. A massive digital tactical table dominated the center of the room. "Bring it up, Vance," Sterling ordered, shedding his dress coat. Vance stepped to the terminal, his fingers dancing across the encrypted keyboard. "Yes, sir." Accessing National Reconnaissance Office feed. Codename: Operation Broken Anvil. The tactical table flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across Valerie's gaunt, dirt-streaked face. A high-resolution satellite topographical map materialized. It was a jagged, unforgiving landscape, deep ravines, sheer cliff faces, and a smoldering compound reduced to rubble. Syrian-Iraqi border, the Al-Walid crossing, Vance briefed, his voice steady, slipping effortlessly into his role as the intel coordinator. A highly volatile gray zone. 3 days ago, a Tier 1 element, call sign Echo Actual, was inserted to extract a high-value intelligence asset. The intel was bad. It was a trap. Valerie didn't move, but her eyes were locked onto the digital terrain. The geography was different from the Red Valley in Afghanistan, but the tactical nightmare was exactly the same. Echo Actual, Valerie whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Who? Sterling placed a heavy hand on the edge of the table. Marcus, Miller, Doc, Henderson, Reyes, and Sergeant Major Thomas. The names hit Valerie like physical blows. Vance watched her closely. She closed her eyes, and he saw a tear cut a clean track through the grime on her cheek. These were her boys, the 5 men she had bled for 4 years ago. The ones who had survived because she had taken 3 rounds to the chest and shoulder to keep them breathing. They survived the initial ambush. Vance continued, tapping the screen to zoom in on a cluster of rocks at the base of a steep ravine. They managed to secure a defensible position in this box canyon. But they are pinned. Drone surveillance shows approximately 60 heavily armed insurgents holding the high ground. Slowly tightening the noose. Why haven't we pulled them out? Valerie's voice suddenly hardened. The tremor in her hands stopped. The homeless vagrant was fading. The Force Recon operator was waking up. Send a QRF. Send the Night Stalkers. Level the grid. We can't, Sterling said grimly. They crossed the border due to a navigational malfunction during evasion. They are officially in unauthorized airspace. If an American gunship or a quick reaction force crosses that line, it triggers a geopolitical chain reaction that kicks off a regional war. The Pentagon's hands are tied. Officially, Echo Actual does not exist. If they die down there, they die in the dark. So you want me to do it? Valerie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy frequency. You want me to cross the line alone? No backup, no extraction guarantee. A suicide mission to fix a Pentagon screw-up. I want you to save your brothers. Val, Sterling said, his voice breaking slightly, because nobody else on this green earth can make the shots required to clear that ridge. The insertion point is a high-altitude halo jump at night. The overwatch position is an exposed plateau 1.200 yards from the enemy line. It's an impossible shooting solution. Sterling reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tactical radio receiver. He set it on the digital table. An hour ago, they managed to push a burst transmission through a scrambled frequency. It's Thomas. Sterling pressed play. Through the heavy static, the sound of sporadic, distant gunfire crackled into the quiet room. Then, a ragged, exhausted voice, choked with dust and pain. Echo Actual to any. We are combat ineffective. Reyes is hit, bad. We have maybe 3 mags left. They're moving in. Tell my wife, tell her. A violent cough interrupted the transmission, followed by a dry, bitter laugh. Man, I wish Wraith was here. She always hated when we were late for dinner. Echo Actual, going dark. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vance swallowed hard, feeling the profound weight of the audio. He looked at Valerie. She was staring at the radio. Her jaw clenched so tight the muscles ticked in her cheek. The ghosts of the 12 men she had lost were still etched onto her skin. But the lives of the 5 men she could still save were echoing in that room. Slowly, Valerie Quinn raised her head. The transformation was complete. The defeated, broken woman who had walked onto the base looking for a scrap of belonging was dead. Wraith 9 was back. Her gray eyes were terrifyingly clear, calculating wind, distance, and blood. "I need a shower," Valerie said, her voice a sharp, commanding bark. "I need a sterile medical suite to bind these ribs. I want a suppressed .338 Lapua Magnum, custom-loaded match-grade rounds, and a secondary M110 system." Sterling exhaled a breath he looked like he'd been holding for 3 years. "It's already waiting in the armory. We launch out of Andrews in 3 hours." Valerie turned her piercing gaze away from the general and locked eyes directly with Captain Vance. Vance felt a sudden, involuntary spike of adrenaline. Being looked at by a Tier 1 sniper was like being painted by a laser designator. "And I need him," Valerie said, pointing a scarred finger at Vance. Vance blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "Me? Master Gunnery Sergeant. I'm an intelligence officer. I don't run Black Ops fieldwork." "You saw me," Valerie said, stepping closer to him. "On the range. You didn't look at my clothes, you looked at my hands. You recognized the biomechanics. You kept your head when that idiot lieutenant lost his. I'm going into a blind valley 1.200 yards out. I need a spotter who can process raw satellite telemetry, read atmospheric shifts in real time, and call my ballistics without panicking when the lead starts flying." She stepped within inches of him, her intensity burning through the lingering smell of the streets. "I don't need a trigger puller. Captain Vance, I need a brain. You coming, or are you going to stay here and write reports?" Vance looked at the satellite map, then at General Sterling, who gave a single, firm nod. The analytical, safe part of Vance's brain screamed at him to stay in the bunker. But the part of him that had sworn an oath to leave no man behind silenced the fear. Vance met Valerie's icy gaze and straightened his posture. "I'll get my gear." "Good," Valerie said, turning toward the medical bay doors. She paused, looking over her shoulder at the general. "General Sterling, when this is over, I want my DD-214 updated." "To what, Val?" Sterling asked. "To active duty," she said, before disappearing into the sterile white corridor. Operation Broken Anvil had just found its hammer. The interior of the C-17 Globemaster III was a cavern of vibrating steel and deafening noise. Flying at 30,000 feet over the Mediterranean, heading fast toward the Syrian-Iraqi border, the aircraft's cargo hold was bathed in the harsh, blood-red glow of the jump lights. Captain Elias Vance sat strapped into the webbing of his jump seat, the heavy canvas of his parachute harness biting into his shoulders. He was breathing pure, dry oxygen through a specialized high-altitude mask. Every breath sounded like Darth Vader echoing in his own skull. The temperature in the unpressurized cabin had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Vance looked down at his hands. They were encased in thick tactical gloves, resting on the ruggedized ballistic tablet strapped to his thigh. He was an intelligence officer. His battlefield was usually a glowing screen in a climate-controlled room in Virginia. The heaviest thing he usually dropped into a combat zone was a drone strike. Now, he was about to step out of a perfectly good airplane into a black void. Armed with an M4, a spotting scope, and a meteorological telemetry kit, he glanced across the narrow aisle. Valerie Quinn sat perfectly still. The transformation from the trembling, filthy vagrant at Fort Stryker to the apex predator sitting across from him was absolute. It was terrifying. She wore a specialized matte black halo, high-altitude low-opening, suit. The matted, dirty hair was gone, shaved down to a tight, efficient buzz cut in the base medical bay before departure. Her scarred collarbone and the tattooed graveyard on her shoulder were hidden beneath layers of Kevlar and ceramic trauma plates. Strapped securely to the front of her harness was the weapon she had requested, an Accuracy International AXSR sniper rifle chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, equipped with a heavy suppressor and a thermal optic scope that cost more than Vance's car. It was a weapon designed to kill armored targets at distances where the sound of the gunshot would arrive seconds after the target was already dead. Valerie's eyes, visible through the visor of her oxygen helmet, were wide open. They weren't dead anymore. They were electric. They were calculating. A green light flashed near the cockpit door. The jumpmaster, a hulking special tactics operator communicating via hand signals to maintain radio silence, pointed 2 fingers at Valerie and Vance, then slashed his hand horizontally across his chest. 10 minutes to drop zone. Vance nodded, his stomach performing a slow, sickening roll. He unbuckled his safety tether and stood up, the shifting gravity of the massive plane threatening to throw him off balance. Valerie rose beside him. Her movements were fluid, economical, no wasted energy. With a mechanical whine that vibrated through the floorboards, the massive rear cargo ramp of the C-17 began to lower. The darkness outside wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical presence. The roar of the jet engines and the howling rush of the slipstream rushed into the cabin. A violent, deafening hurricane of sub-zero air. Vance felt the cold slice right through his thermal layers. They waddled toward the edge of the ramp, weighed down by over 100 pounds of gear. Below them, 30,000 feet down, lay a hostile, jagged stretch of desert. No friendlies, no extraction, just a box canyon crawling with insurgents, and 5 trapped Americans waiting to die. The jumpmaster held up his hand. 5 fingers. 4, 3, 2, 1. He pointed straight out into the abyss. Go. Valerie didn't hesitate. She didn't brace herself. She simply stepped off the edge of the ramp and was instantly swallowed by the night, vanishing like a ghost into the slipstream. Vance took a breath of canned oxygen, squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, and threw himself forward. The sheer violence of the freefall hit him like a concrete wall. The wind roared in his ears, a deafening shriek that drowned out his own thoughts. Gravity seized him, pulling him toward the earth at terminal velocity, 120 miles per hour. Vance forced his eyes open and arched his back, stabilizing his fall into a box position. He blinked away the watering in his eyes and activated his night vision goggles, NVGs. The world snapped from pitch black to a grainy, luminescent green. Below him, he spotted a tiny, flashing infrared strobe. It was Valerie. She was falling in a perfect, aggressive delta track, angling her body to cut through the air and guide them toward the specific geographic coordinates of the insertion point. Vance adjusted his pitch, fighting the buffeting wind, and followed the blinking green beacon of his sniper. For 2 straight minutes, they plummeted through the stratosphere. It was a terrifying, silent ballet. Down here, there were no generals, no loud-mouthed lieutenants, no crowds with smartphones. There was only the physics of falling and the impending reality of the ground. His wrist altimeter beeped wildly in his ear. 5,000 feet. 4,000. At exactly 3,500 feet, Valerie's infrared strobe suddenly shot upward as her main canopy deployed. Vance reached back, grabbed his ripcord, and pulled. The deceleration was brutal. The harness jerked him violently upward, knocking the wind out of his lungs. He looked up, verifying the rectangular ram air canopy was fully inflated and untangled. Good canopy. He reached up, grabbed the steering toggles, and exhaled a shaky breath. The deafening roar of the freefall was instantly replaced by an eerie, sweeping silence. The wind merely whispered through the suspension lines. Through his NVGs, the terrain below began to resolve. It was a nightmare of jagged ravines, sharp ridgelines, and dry wadis. They were steering silently into the Al-Walid crossing. Vance checked his wrist-mounted GPS. They were 2 miles from the target box canyon where Echo Actual was pinned down. Valerie was a silent, dark shadow gliding 50 yards ahead of him. She flared her canopy, banking sharply to the left to spiral down into a narrow, winding canyon that would mask their radar signature from any localized insurgent anti-air systems. Vance followed, his heart pounding as the sheer rock walls rose up on either side of them, glowing green in his night vision. It was like threading a needle in the dark. At 100 feet, the ground rushed up to meet them. Valerie touched down with the grace of a feral cat, her knees absorbing the impact. She instantly hit the quick release on her harness, shedding the heavy parachute before it could drag her in the wind. Vance came in hotter. He hit the sandy floor of the ravine, stumbled forward, and rolled over his shoulder to bleed off the momentum. He scrambled to his knees, punching the release buckles on his chest and legs. Before Vance could even catch his breath, Valerie was beside him. Her oxygen mask was off. Her NVGs pushed up on her helmet. She had the heavy .338 Lapua unslung and in her hands, her eyes scanning the dark ridgelines above them. "We're down," Vance whispered, his voice hoarse. He tapped his GPS. "We are 1.2 miles from the Overwatch Plateau. Elevation gain of 800 feet to get to our firing position." Valerie didn't say a word. She reached down, scooped up a handful of the cold desert sand, and let it sift through her fingers, feeling the subtle shifts in the microcurrents of the wind at the canyon floor. She looked at Vance, her face painted in the pale moonlight that filtered down through the canyon walls. The ghost was home. "Radio silence from here on out, Captain," she whispered, her voice colder than the desert night. "We move fast. We move quiet. The sun comes up in 4 hours. By then, the men in that valley are either walking out, or we're all dying in the dirt." She turned and melted into the shadows of the ravine, her boots making absolutely no sound on the rocky terrain. Vance unslung his M4 carbine, chambered a round with a quiet click, and followed the angel of death into the dark. The climb was a grueling, agonizing exercise in silent suffering. 800 feet of vertical elevation over loose shale, razor-sharp limestone, and crumbling sandstone. Captain Elias Vance's lungs burned, screaming for oxygen in the thin, frigid desert air. His thighs felt like they were packed with battery acid, every step a monumental effort under the crushing weight of his tactical gear. He was dripping with sweat despite the sub-zero wind chill. 10 yards ahead of him, Valerie Quinn moved like a phantom. She didn't slip. She didn't dislodge a single pebble, despite the fact that she had spent the last 3 years living on the streets, eating out of dumpsters, and sleeping on concrete. Her muscle memory had completely hijacked her malnourished body. Her ribs were tightly bound beneath her Kevlar. Vance had seen the brutal, purple bruising in the medical bay, but she climbed with the relentless, mechanical drive of a Terminator. She wasn't climbing with her muscles, she was climbing with her ghosts. It took them 45 minutes to scale the ridge. As they crested the top, flattening their bodies against the freezing rock, the plateau opened up before them. It was a narrow, exposed shelf of rock jutting out over a massive, yawning abyss. "We're here," Valerie whispered, her voice barely a breath against the wind. They crawled on their bellies to the edge of the precipice. Below them, a mile down and 1,200 yards across the gap, lay the Box Canyon. It was a jagged scar cut deep into the earth, shrouded in the ink-black shadows of the pre-dawn night. Valerie unslung the massive .338 Lapua Magnum. With fluid, practiced motions, she deployed the bipod. Click. She settled the stock into the hollow of her shoulder, adjusting the cheek weld, her hands working entirely by feel in the pitch black. Vance moved in right beside her. He unrolled his primary tool, a high-powered, military-grade spotting scope linked to a thermal imaging feed. He set up his Kestrel wind meter, mounting it on a tiny tripod to read the atmospheric data, and pulled out his ruggedized ballistic tablet. This was his battlefield, the math. Vance flicked his scope to thermal white hot and pressed his eye to the rubber eye cup. The grainy green darkness of his night vision was instantly replaced by a stark, high-contrast world of black terrain and glowing white heat signatures. "I have the valley floor," Vance whispered, his fingers flying across his tablet. "Talk to me, Vance," Valerie said. She hadn't looked through her rifle scope yet. She was staring at the dark horizon with her naked eyes, letting her pupils adjust to the ambient starlight, waiting for the data. "Target-rich environment," Vance said, his voice tightening as he scanned the ridges below. "I'm counting thermal blooms. 10, 20. I've got at least 60 hostiles. They are moving in a classic pincer formation, utilizing the boulder fields for cover. They have high ground on 3 sides of the canyon's choke point." He panned the scope down, searching the rubble at the very back of the canyon, searching for friendlies, searching. Vance's breath hitched. "I have Echo Actual," he said, the words heavy with dread. At the base of a sheer cliff, pinned behind the crumbling remains of an ancient, stone shepherd's wall, were 5 faint heat signatures. They were clustered tight, too tight. "Status?" Valerie asked, Her voice was flat, but Vance could hear the microscopic tremor of barely contained panic beneath it. "They're battered, Vance reported, forcing himself to remain clinical. "One man is down, flat on his back, looks like a massive heat bleed from his lower quadrant, arterial trauma. That has to be Reyes. 2 men are rendering aid. The other 2 are holding the line." Vance zoomed in to maximum magnification. Through the thermal feed, he could see the man leaning against the wall, holding an M4. It was Sergeant Major Thomas. Even as a glowing white blob on a screen, Vance could read the exhaustion in his posture. Thomas ejected a magazine, checked it, and slapped it back in. It was a terrifyingly quick motion. "They're black on ammo," Vance said softly. Thomas just checked his mag. "They aren't shooting back, they're conserving for the final breach." Valerie finally pressed her eye to the optic of the Lapua. Through her scope, the world narrowed to a circle of glowing white and deep black. The crosshairs, fine, merciless black lines, hovered over the valley. She found the stone wall. She found the 5 glowing shapes. Marcus, Miller, Doc, Reyes, Tommy. Her boys, the men who had pulled her bleeding, unconscious body onto the medevac chopper in the Red Valley 4 years ago. The men who had told her it wasn't her fault the others died. A jagged, phantom pain flared in her shoulder where the shrapnel scars lived. For 3 years, she had convinced herself she was dead. She had let the world walk over her because she believed she didn't deserve to stand. Not tonight, she thought. Tonight, the Wraith pays her debts. "Give me the math, Vance," she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into that terrifying, deadpan frequency he had heard on the firing range. The homeless woman was entirely gone. Vance looked at his Kestrel meter and punched the data into his ballistic calculator. This wasn't a firing range. This was an impossible shot. The variables were staggering. Distance to the leading insurgent element is exactly 1,240 yards. Vance whispered, reading the glowing numbers on his tablet. Elevation drop is -800 feet. That gives us a severe downward shooting angle. The bullet will impact high if you don't hold under. "I know the angle," Valerie said, her finger gently resting against the side of the trigger guard. "Give me the wind." "Wind is the nightmare," Vance said, his eyes darting between the digital meter and the visual cues in the valley, dust kicking up off the rocks. "Base wind at our altitude is 8 miles per hour from your 3 o'clock. But we are shooting across a massive thermal updraft from the canyon floor. The wind is shearing down in the valley. It's swirling back from 9 o'clock at 4 miles per hour. Full value crosswind up top. Half value inverse of the target." Valerie muttered, doing the complex trigonometry in her head faster than Vance's computer. "Spindrift and Coriolis? At 1,200 yards, the Earth's rotation will pull your round 3 inches to the right. Bullet spin will pull it another 2. Barometric pressure is 28.1 inches of mercury. Temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. The air is dense. It's going to slow the .338 down faster than standard." Vance paused, looking at the final firing solution on his screen. It looked like absolute gibberish to a layman. But to a sniper, it was the blueprint of death. "Val, the flight time of the bullet is going to be 1.8 seconds. You have to lead a moving target by nearly 2 full seconds. Your holdover is 10.4 mils up, and 2.2 mils left for the windage." Vance looked up from the screen, his heart pounding. "It's a threading the needle shot. Val, if you miss, you give away our position, and the hostiles will overrun Echo Actual before you can rack the bolt for a second round." "I don't miss, Captain," she whispered. Vance looked back through his spotting scope. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the second. "Movement," Vance hissed. 2 o'clock from Echo's position. 3 hostiles advancing. One of them is carrying a heavy tube. RPG. They're setting up to fire down into the friendly's cover. If that rocket hits the wall, Echo Actual is wiped out. "I see them," Valerie said. She centered her crosshairs on the glowing white silhouette of the insurgent holding the rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The man was kneeling behind a boulder, hefting the weapon onto his shoulder, preparing to aim. Distance: 1.240 yards. Flight time: 1.8 seconds. Valerie controlled her breathing. In, out, in. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, feeling the freezing wind brushing against the bare skin of her cheek. She didn't just read the wind, she felt it. She opened her eyes. The crosshairs shifted, hovering in the empty, dark space high and to the left of the RPG gunner's head. Aiming at nothing, trusting the math, trusting the spotter, trusting the ghost. She reached the natural respiratory pause. The world went perfectly, completely silent. Her fingers slid onto the trigger. 3 pounds of pressure. Thud. The heavy suppressor swallowed the violent explosion of the .338 Lapua Magnum cartridge. The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder, driving backward with brutal recoil. "Shot out," Valerie whispered. Through the spotting scope, Vance watched the empty space. 1 second, 1.5 seconds. Down in the valley, the insurgent with the RPG stood up to take aim. At exactly 1.8 seconds, the thermal bloom of the insurgent's head violently exploded into a mist of white-hot pixels. The man crumpled backward, dead before the supersonic crack of the bullet ever reached the canyon floor. The live RPG tube clattered uselessly into the rocks. Impact. Target neutralized. Vance breathed, his entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the kill. Perfect center mass headshot. Good God. Down in the canyon, absolute chaos erupted. The insurgents, suddenly realizing they were taking highly accurate, suppressed fire from the heavens, scrambled for cover. Behind the stone wall, Sergeant Major Thomas flinched at the sound of the distant crack, watching the RPG gunner drop. Through Vance's high magnification scope, he could see Thomas look up. He looked directly toward the dark, imposing plateau a mile away. Even through the thermal distortion, Vance could almost see the weary, bloody smile spreading across Thomas's face. Valerie didn't smile. She didn't pause. She smoothly racked the bolt of the Lapua, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and chambering a fresh round of death. "They're panicking," Valerie said, her voice a cold, surgical blade. "Give me the next target. Vance, we have 59 left." Vance wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands flying over his tablet, fully locked into the lethal rhythm. Target acquired. 10 o'clock. Moving fast behind the rusted truck. Hold 10.4 up. 2.0 left. Wind is shifting. Send it. Valerie breathed. And the angel of death went to work. The box canyon below had become a killing jar. For the first 4 minutes, the insurgents didn't even know what was hitting them. The psychological terror of a suppressed sniper operating from extreme elevation is absolute. There is no muzzle flash to spot. The supersonic crack of the bullet arriving at its target echoes off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the origin of the shot. Men simply folded in half, their armor shattered, their lives extinguished by an invisible, localized lightning strike. Up on the freezing plateau, Captain Elias Vance was sweating through his thermal gear. His eye was practically welded to the rubber cup of his spotting scope. He was no longer just an intelligence analyst, he was the conductor of a lethal symphony. Target. 4 o'clock from the burned-out transport. He's crawling up the scree, trying to flank Thomas's position. Wind? Valerie asked, her voice an absolute, terrifying flatline. Swirling, half-value right to left. Hold 10.5 up. 1.2 right. Thud. Impact. Vance called out immediately, watching the thermal bloom of the crawling insurgent go instantly still. Shift left. 2 targets stacked behind the rusted water tank. One is holding a radio. Distance? 1280. Hold 10.8 up. The wind just spiked in the gorge, full value. Hold 2.5 left. Thud. Thud. 2 shots fired in less than 3 seconds. Down in the valley, both heat signatures dropped behind the water tank and didn't get back up. Valerie Quinn was operating on a plane of existence that Vance could barely comprehend. Her bolt manipulation was so fast, so fluid, it looked like a magic trick. She didn't flinch at the recoil. The massive .338 Lapua Magnum kicked her shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. But she simply rode the kinetic energy, letting it reset her crosshairs perfectly for the next shot. The heavy barrel of the rifle was already radiating a mirage of heat into the freezing night air. Down in the dirt, Echo Actual realized exactly what was happening. Through his high-powered optics, Vance saw Sergeant Major Thomas aggressively tap the shoulder of the medic. "Doc, Henderson." Thomas pointed up at the sky, then pointed at the insurgent line. He was rallying his broken team. The cavalry hadn't arrived, but the Angel of Death had. "They're taking advantage of the confusion," Vance reported, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Echo is shifting position, dragging Reyes to better cover. "Keep your eyes on the hostiles, Vance," Valerie commanded, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh 5-round box into the mag well without taking her eye off the scope. "They aren't stupid, they're going to figure out the geometry." She was right. Insurgents who survive long enough to fight in the Syrian-Iraqi gray zones are hardened. Adaptive combatants. Down in the canyon, an insurgent commander, a massive heat signature radiating anger, started screaming orders, kicking his men out from behind their cover. He had looked at the angle of the blood spatter. He had looked at the way his men were falling. He knew the shots weren't coming from the ground. He pointed a long, curved blade directly up at the dark ridgeline. Directly at them. "Val." Vance's voice spiked with a sudden, icy jolt of adrenaline. "We've been made. They're looking up." "Let them look," Valerie said coldly. "Give me the commander." "Distance 1220. He's moving fast. Laterally. You'll need to trap him. Hold 10.2 up. 2.0 left. Lead him by a full mil." Valerie tracked the moving target, her breathing slowing to an impossible crawl. She pre-positioned her crosshairs in the empty space ahead of the running commander, waiting for him to step into his own death. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Suddenly, a massive, brilliant tongue of flame erupted from the mouth of a cave at the far end of the canyon. Before Vance could even shout a warning, the sky above their plateau was torn to shreds. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't the sharp crack of small arms fire. It was the deep, rhythmic, chest-caving thud-thud-thud of a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. The insurgents had a modified pickup truck, hidden in the cave. And they were aiming the anti-aircraft gun directly at the ridgeline. Glowing red tracer rounds, the size of hot dogs, arced up through the night sky like angry hornets. "Incoming," Vance screamed, violently grabbing the collar of Valerie's tactical vest and hauling her downward. A split second later, the edge of their plateau simply exploded. Heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into the limestone cliff face just inches below their position. The kinetic impact shattered the rock, sending a wave of jagged, razor-sharp stone shrapnel flying into the air. Vance buried his face in the dirt, throwing his arms over his helmet. He felt the terrifying, supersonic snap of a 12.7mm round pass so close to his head that the vacuum of the bullet tugged at his uniform. The noise was deafening, a localized earthquake vibrating through his ribcage. Suppressing fire, Vance yelled over the roar, spitting out a mouthful of sand and grit. "They have a DSHK mounted on a truck. They're walking the fire right onto our position." Valerie was pinned flat against the earth, shielding the delicate optics of her rifle with her own body. The ghost of Red Valley was suddenly surrounded by the exact same auditory nightmare that had broken her mind 3 years ago. The smell of pulverized rock, hot metal, and ozone filled her nostrils. For one terrifying second, Vance saw her eyes widen in pure, unadulterated panic. Her breathing hitched into a rapid, shallow hyperventilation. The ghosts were clawing at her, dragging her back to the dirt of Afghanistan, back to the screams of the 12 men she couldn't save. "Valerie," Vance shouted, grabbing her shoulder. He didn't care about rank right now. He needed the wraith. "Valerie, look at me." She blinked, her icy gray eyes locking onto his. The terror in them was heartbreaking. "You are not in the valley." Vance roared over the deafening barrage of heavy machine gun fire shredding the rock above them. "You are on the mountain. You are the wraith, and Echo Actual is going to die in 3 minutes if you don't take out that gun." Her breath caught. The panic hovered for a fraction of a second, fighting a desperate war against her training. Then, her jaw locked. The terror vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, concentrated wrath. "I can't get over the berm," Valerie gritted out, her voice tight but entirely steady. Slabs of rock were detonating just inches above their heads. "If I pop up to acquire the target, that DSHK will cut me in half. I need a blind solution. Vance, you have to feed it to me. Vance understood immediately. She was going to pre-dial the scope and pre-align her body while flat on the ground. She would only expose herself for the half-second it took to pull the trigger. If his math was wrong, she would miss, and the machine gun would rip her apart. Vance slid his Kestrel meter closer, sheltering his ballistic tablet under his chest. He risked raising his spotting scope just a fraction of an inch above the rock line. A tracer round sparked off a boulder 3 feet to his left, showering his helmet in sparks. But he didn't flinch. He found the blinding, white-hot muzzle flash of the heavy machine gun in his thermal lens. I have the gunner, Vance shouted. Distance is exactly 1,300 yards. He is firing from an elevated truck bed inside the cave mouth. Wind is swirling heavily at the cave entrance. Call it a full 5 miles per hour from your 9 o'clock. Valerie didn't look over the edge. She lay flat on her side, her hands moving over the turrets of her scope with blind, mechanical precision. Click, click, click. She was dialing the elevation and windage directly into the optic. Hold over, she demanded. Elevation dial is 11.2 mils. Windage dial is 2.8 mils left. Vance checked the telemetry one last time. It was a mathematical prayer. The target is static, but he's laying down a wall of lead. You have 1 shot. Val, 1 second. Understood. Valerie rolled onto her stomach. She pulled the stock of the rifle tight into her shoulder. She closed her eyes. On my mark, Vance said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. 3, 2, 1, up. Valerie pushed herself up on her elbows, exposing her head and shoulders to the terrifying storm of incoming fire. She didn't search for the target. She didn't scan. She threw her eye into the scope, her pre-dialed crosshairs landing instantly on the brilliant muzzle flash of the DSHK. A tracer round screamed past her ear, so close it singed the fabric of her collar. She didn't blink. Thud. She dropped flat against the rock a millisecond after the recoil punched her shoulder. Vance held his breath, staring through his spotting scope. The 1.9-second flight time felt like an eternity. The DSHK continued to roar, chewing the ridgeline to dust. And then, abruptly, the heavy, rhythmic thudding stopped. The massive muzzle flash in the cave vanished. Through the thermal optic, Vance watched the glowing white heat signature of the gunner slump over the heavy weapon. Dead. The silence that rushed back into the desert night was deafening. Vance slowly lowered his spotting scope. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the tablet. He looked over at Valerie. She was lying on her back, staring up at the cold, indifferent stars, taking deep, shuddering breaths. Gunner is down, Vance whispered, the words tumbling out of him in a rush of profound relief. Target neutralized. Valerie rolled back onto her stomach, cycling the bolt of the Lapua. We aren't done, Captain. We just kicked the hornet's nest. Tell me what Echo Actual is doing. Vance looked back through the optic. The destruction of the heavy machine gun had completely broken the insurgents' morale. They had lost their commander, their heavy support, and they were dying from an enemy they couldn't even see. Panic was a virus, and it was spreading fast through the canyon floor. But the real miracle was happening at the stone wall. Echo is moving, Vance reported, a fierce, triumphant grin breaking across his face. Thomas is leading them out. They've got Reyes on a litter. They are pushing toward the extraction coordinates at the north end of the canyon. The hostiles are retreating into the cave systems. They're breaking. Val, you broke them. Valerie peered through her scope, watching her boys, her ghosts, limp their way out of the kill zone. For the first time since Captain Vance had laid eyes on her back at Fort Stryker. The icy, deadpan mask slipped completely. A single, exhausted smile touched the corners of her mouth. Keep spotting, Captain, she said softly, keeping her crosshairs sweeping the canyon walls, guarding their retreat. Let's walk them home. The eastern sky began to bleed. The first rays of dawn pierced the night, bruising the jagged cliffs of the Al-Walid Canyon with shades of violent orange and deep purple. The desert landscape snapped into sharp relief, ruthless and barren, exposing the dust-choked battlefield below. On the rock shelf suspended in midair, Captain Elias Vance blinked rapidly. fighting the gritty sting in his eyes from the high-powered optics. He flipped his night vision goggles up onto his helmet. His naked eyes now tracked Echo Actual moving along the dry riverbed. They moved slowly, a battered, limping formation carrying a makeshift litter holding Reyes. But they were moving northward, toward the designated helicopter landing zone. "They're clear of the kill box," Vance said hoarsely, his freezing fingers flying across his ballistic tablet to send the final encrypted burst transmission. "I just caught the relay from command. 2 Pave Hawks coming in on the deck. Estimated time of arrival is 6 minutes." Beside him, Valerie Quinn didn't answer. Her silence was entirely different from her previous deadly focus. Vance turned and saw her resting her forehead against the stock of the massive .338 Lapua Magnum. The adrenaline, the only chemical keeping her malnourished body operating at superhuman capacity for the last 4 hours, was running dry. It was a steep, violent crash. She was shaking uncontrollably, not from the chill of the desert dawn, but from the brutal toll of becoming Wraith 9 again. Her body curled inward, the fractured ribs compressed beneath her Kevlar vest now screaming in agony with every breath. "Val," Vance said softly, carefully reaching out but not quite touching her. "Mission accomplished. Safe the weapon. We need to move." She slowly raised her head. Her face was smeared with mud, gun oil, and sweat. Her icy gray eyes were shattered now, revealing a profound, crushing exhaustion, the fatigue of a soul that had carried too many lives. She fumbled with the bolt. The hands that had executed flawless, impossible shots minutes ago were now shaking so badly she couldn't engage the safety. "Let me," Vance whispered. He slid closer, expertly dropping the magazine and racking the bolt to clear the live round. He took the massive rifle from her trembling hands and slung it over his own shoulder. "You did it, Val. You brought them home." Valerie closed her eyes, a shuddering breath escaping her cracked lips. "Now, I'm the one who needs to be carried, Captain." Vance nodded. He wrapped his arm around her shoulder, using his own strength to pull the legendary sniper to her feet. They began the agonizing trek down the opposite side of the ridge toward the HLZ. Every step was torture for Valerie. Vance had to carry nearly half her body weight, but he didn't utter a single complaint. Tonight, he had watched a god of war wake up. And now, he was carrying a flesh and blood human being back to reality. The heavy thwack 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 of rotor blades ripped through the horizon. 2 black HH-60 Pave Hawks, flying so low their bellies nearly grazed the dunes, roared into the canyon. The desert floor erupted into a massive brownout as they flared for landing. The first chopper took Echo Actual. The second touched down just 30 yards from Vance and Valerie. Pararescue jumpers leapt from the bird, weapons raised to pull security, while Vance and Valerie stumbled toward the open side door. Vance shoved Valerie onto the aluminum deck before hauling himself up. The sliding door slammed shut, sealing out the chaos of the desert. The Pave Hawk banked hard and roared into the sky, leaving the valley of death behind. Inside the dim cabin, bathed only in strobing red tactical lights, nobody spoke. Nobody could over the deafening roar of the twin turbines. Vance collapsed into the mesh web seat, squeezing his eyes shut. He pulled off his helmet, exposing his sweat-matted hair. Minutes later, the intercom crackled in his headset. "Package secured. Echo Actual is on Bird 1. Reyes is critical but stabilized. En route to forward operating base." Vance looked over at Valerie. She was curled up in the corner seat, her head resting against the vibrating fuselage. Eyes closed, she looked exactly like the ragged, broken woman he had first seen at Fort Stryker, not the killing machine from the battlefield. 45 minutes later, the 2 choppers touched down at a classified airbase in Jordan. As the doors slid open, the organized chaos of the military took over. Medical teams with gurneys rushed Bird 1. Vance jumped down first, offering a hand to help Valerie. Her legs nearly buckled as her boots hit the tarmac. 20 yards away, on the sun-baked asphalt, the medevac team was frantically loading Reyes into an ambulance. The other 4 men of Echo Actual, Marcus Miller, Doc Henderson, and Sergeant Major Thomas, stepped off the first chopper. Their body armor was shredded, caked in dried blood and desert dust. Thomas limped heavily, his left arm wrapped in blood-soaked gauze, his face carved with the deep lines of exhaustion and despair. Thomas stopped. The old sergeant major's bloodshot eyes scanned the tarmac. Searching. He wasn't looking at the medics. He wasn't looking at the approaching base brass. He was searching for the guardian angels who had rained hellfire down on the valley to save them. And then, his gaze locked. Not far away, standing next to the tactical geared intelligence captain, was a small, frail woman in a dust-caked black halo suit. Her hair was buzzed close to the scalp. She stood there, leaning most of her fragile weight against a base jeep, her gray eyes staring straight back at him. Time seemed to freeze on the windy tarmac. Thomas blinked, his cracked lips trembled, his breathing hitched. Marcus, Miller, and Doc stopped dead in their tracks, following their team leader's gaze. The hardest special operators on Earth, men who had stared death in the face without blinking for 3 straight days, suddenly went rigid as statues. "Impossible," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. The desert wind snatched the words away, but the shape of his mouth was unmistakable. Valerie stood up straight, gently pushing Vance away. She took a single, unsteady step forward, but her eyes never left Thomas. Thomas abandoned the medical team. He started walking. Then, he ran, the heavy, limping run of a man carrying too many wounds. He stopped exactly 2 paces away from her. The towering, bearded sergeant major, covered in mud and blood, looked down at the tiny woman standing before him. His eyes traced her hollow cheekbones, the old scars on her neck, and finally rested on the tattoo peeking out from her collar, the shattered hourglass surrounded by gold and black stars. "God, Val?" Thomas called out, the sound choking in his throat like a lost child. "Is it really you? I'm sorry I was late." "Tommy," Valerie said. The cold, lethal voice of Wraith 9 was completely gone. In its place was the cracked, fragile voice of a little sister carrying a mountain of guilt. I couldn't save the others at Red Valley. I'm sorry." Tears spilled from the old veteran's eyes. Thomas didn't say another word. He stepped forward and wrapped his massive, filthy arms around Valerie. He held her tight, burying his face in her shoulder, completely ignoring the crowds of base personnel. He wept, the ragged, gasping sobs of a soldier who had lost all hope and finally found the light. "It wasn't your fault," Thomas sobbed, holding onto her like he was terrified she would vanish into thin air again. "You brought us home. You brought us home then. And you came for us today. You're our hero. Val, do you hear me? It was never your fault." Marcus, Miller, and Doc rushed forward, enveloping Valerie in a tight, rough embrace. Tears and desert dirt mingled on sun-baked faces. They held onto her, a circle of life, of brotherhood, of ghosts walking out of hell to find each other again. A few steps away, Captain Elias Vance watched in silence. He lowered his head, a relieved, sorrowful, but warm smile touching his lips. Vance was an intelligence officer. He processed the world through data, maps, and cold ballistics. But in that moment, he realized that the most powerful weapon in the United States military wasn't its artillery or its satellite tech. It was the unbreakable loyalty of its soldiers. It was the fierce, bloody love they held for one another in the deepest, darkest places. Valerie Quinn had lost herself on the streets. She had let the ghosts of her past torture her for 3 long years. But this morning, under the blazing desert sun of Jordan, Wraith 9 finally laid down her rifle. And Valerie Quinn, at long last, was home. 6 months later. The crisp, biting air of the Colorado autumn carried the scent of pine and rain across the sprawling campus of the Rocky Mountain Veterans Rehabilitation Center. The aspen trees had turned a brilliant, burning gold, shedding their leaves over the manicured lawns. Captain Elias Vance walked up the paved pathway, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a civilian leather jacket. He wasn't wearing his uniform today. He didn't need the weight of the brass on his collar, he just needed to see an old friend. The past 6 months had been a bureaucratic hurricane at the Pentagon. Operation Broken Anvil was officially scrubbed from all records. Echo Actual's extraction was quietly reclassified as a routine training exfiltration. Lieutenant Jackson Pierce had been unceremoniously discharged. his career evaporating overnight after General Sterling personally saw to his court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. But Vance didn't care about the paperwork or the politics. He followed the distant, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of small-caliber rifle fired to the back of the facility. He found her on the therapeutic shooting range. Valerie Quinn wasn't wearing a filthy, oversized surplus jacket anymore. She wore a clean, fitted tactical fleece and denim jeans. The violent, emaciated sharpness of her cheekbones had softened, replaced by quiet, healthy strength. Her hair had grown out from the military buzzcut into a short, manageable crop. She was standing behind a young Marine sitting in a specialized wheelchair. The kid couldn't have been older than 22. And he was missing both of his legs below the knee. He was holding a customized, low-recoil .22 caliber precision rifle, his hands shaking with the phantom tremors of severe PTSD. Vance leaned against the wooden railing of the observation deck, watching. "I can't do it, Gunny," the young Marine whispered, lowering the rifle, his breathing growing shallow and panicked. "Every time I close my eyes to pull the trigger, I'm back in the vehicle. I smell the IED. I can't breathe." Valerie didn't bark orders. She didn't shame him. She knelt down right next to his wheelchair, getting on eye level with him. "Look at me, Miller," Valerie said softly. Her voice wasn't the dead, icy flatline of the Wraith anymore. It was warm. It was human. "You are not in the vehicle. You are in Colorado. It's 62 degrees. It smells like pine needles. Not cordite. You are safe." The kid swallowed hard, his eyes locking onto hers. "The ghosts are loud today, aren't they?" she asked gently. He nodded, a single tear escaping his eye. "They won't stop screaming." Valerie reached out and placed her hand over his, steadying the trembling rifle. Vance noticed her hands. The shrapnel scars were still there, but they were clean. "They never stop completely, kid," Valerie said, offering him a sad but grounded smile. "I'm not going to lie to you and tell you the ghosts go away. They don't, but you don't have to let them hold the gun. You acknowledge them, you tell them you survived, and then you take a breath. Together, in and out." She breathed with him, slowly. The young Marine's shoulders dropped. The panic receded. He raised the rifle back to his cheek, finding the optic. Natural respiratory pause. Valerie whispered, "Find the stillness. Send it." Pop. A tiny steel target 50 yards downrange chimed with a perfect hit. The young Marine lowered the gun. A massive, shuddering sigh of relief washing over him. A genuine smile broke through the trauma on his face. "Good shooting, Marine," Valerie said, patting him on the shoulder. "Go take a break. Grab some coffee." As the kid wheeled himself off the firing line, Valerie stood up. She wiped her hands on her jeans and turned, finally noticing the intelligence officer leaning against the railing. "You're a long way from your glowing screens in Virginia, Captain Vance," she said, a hint of genuine amusement dancing in her gray eyes. "I had some accumulated leave," Vance replied, walking down the wooden steps to join her on the grass. "Figured I'd come check on the legendary Wraith 9. See if she was still terrorizing local shooting ranges." Valerie chuckled, a real, actual laugh. "Wraith 9 is permanently retired. Elias, I'm just Val now, lead marksmanship and grounding instructor for the PTSD recovery program." "It suits you," Vance said, taking in the profound change in her demeanor. "You look alive." "I feel alive, most days. Anyway." She shoved her hands into her pockets, looking out over the mountains. "Some nights are still bad. The nightmares still come, but I have a bed now. I have a purpose. It makes the weight a little easier to carry." Vance reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. He held it out to her. "Thomas asked me to give this to you," Vance said softly. "He officially retired last month. Bought a fishing boat in Florida. Reyes is out of the hospital, learning to walk with a prosthetic. They're all alive, Val. They're all home." Valerie took the box with hesitant fingers. She popped the lid open. Inside rested a pristine, heavy silver challenge coin. On one side was the emblem of Echo Actual. On the other, engraved in deep, bold lettering, were the words, "For the ghost who walked in the light. Thank you, Echo." Valerie stared at the coin. her vision blurring with unshed tears. She didn't try to hide them this time. She let them fall. She traced the engraved letters with her thumb, feeling the profound, crushing relief of a debt finally paid. "I got some new ink," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She pulled the collar of her fleece slightly to the side. Vance looked closely. The dark, sprawling tattoo of the shattered hourglass was still there on her collarbone. The 12 black stars, the men she couldn't save in the Red Valley, remained permanently etched into her skin as a somber memorial. But right below them, clustered tightly around the center of her chest, were 5 brand new stars. They weren't black, they were tattooed in a vibrant, brilliant gold. 5 golden stars, Vance murmured, a tight, proud smile forming on his lips. "For Echo Actual." "Yeah," Valerie said, looking up at the crisp, blue Colorado sky. "The black stars remind me of the cost of this life. But the gold ones, they remind me why I have to keep living it." She closed the velvet box and slipped it safely into her pocket. She looked at Vance, the man who had stood beside her on that terrifying plateau. The man who had done the math while she dealt the wrath. "Can I buy you a cup of terrible cafeteria coffee, Captain?" she asked. "Only if you tell me how the hell you calculated that 1.8-second lead time without a wind meter." Vance countered, falling into step beside her. "It's not math, Elias," she said, bumping her shoulder playfully against his as they walked back toward the main building. "It's just ghosts." The autumn wind rustled through the golden aspens, scattering leaves across the empty shooting range. But for the first time in years, the wind wasn't howling, it was just a breeze. And the ghosts, finally, were at peace. The cafeteria at the Rocky Mountain Veterans Rehabilitation Center smelled of industrial bleach, overcooked oatmeal, and cheap, burnt coffee. It was a mundane, painfully ordinary setting, exactly the kind of place that made Captain Elias Vance's skin crawl. Vance sat in a plastic booth in the far corner, his back to the wall, eyes naturally covering the 3 exit doors. He watched Valerie Quinn approach with 2 steaming styrofoam cups. She moved with a quiet, unassuming grace, sidestepping a nurse pushing a medication cart without breaking her stride. She looked like a civilian. She looked at peace. Vance hated what he was about to do to her. "Here," Valerie said, sliding a cup across the Formica table. "Black, no sugar, just like the muddy water they served at Bagram. Don't say I never treat you to the finer things." "Appreciate it," Vance said. He took a sip. It was acidic and bitter. He set the cup down carefully. Valerie sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup to soak in the warmth. She looked at him, her gray eyes studying the tight lines around his mouth, the dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there on the firing range 6 months ago. The relaxed, friendly atmosphere from the observation deck suddenly evaporated. The civilian vanished. The sniper returned. "You didn't come to Colorado to check on my mental health, Elias," Valerie said, her voice dropping to a low, flat whisper. "And you didn't come to deliver a challenge coin. What's in your pocket?" Vance didn't smile. He reached into the inner lining of his leather jacket. He didn't pull out a file or weapon. He pulled out a small, matte black rectangular device, no larger than a deck of cards. He pressed a recessed button on its side, and a tiny green LED flared to life. A microscopic, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the tabletop. It was a localized ultrasonic white noise generator. It jammed any listening devices, directional microphones, or cellular signals within a 10-foot radius. Valerie stared at the green light. Her jaw tightened. A SCIF-grade audio jammer in a VA hospital cafeteria. "Tell me right now, Vance, are my boys safe?" "For the moment," Vance said, his voice grim. "Thomas didn't retire to Florida to fish. Val, he went to ground. He bought that boat through 3 shell companies and docked it under a fake name. Reyes isn't doing physical therapy at Walter Reed. He's in a heavily guarded safe house in upstate New York. Marcus, Miller, and Doc are moving locations every 48 hours. Valerie's hands slowly pulled away from her coffee cup. The air in the booth felt like it had dropped 20 degrees. General Sterling promised me Operation Broken Anvil was scrubbed. They were supposed to be protected. Sterling kept his word, Vance said, leaning forward. He scrubbed the op. But someone above Sterling unscrubbed it. 3 weeks ago, Sterling was quietly forced into an early, mandatory retirement. The Pentagon cited health reasons. 2 days after he cleared his desk, I caught a tripwire alert in the SIPRNet database. Vance pulled a folded, heavily encrypted smart paper printout from his pocket and slid it across the table. Valerie unfolded it. That is a heavily redacted requisition order. Vance explained. It was filed by a shadow logistics division within the Department of Defense. It authorizes the deployment of a private military contractor, a Tier 1 mercenary outfit called Blackwood Solutions. Their objective? Asset retrieval and operational cleanup regarding the Al-Walid anomaly. Valerie looked up, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying light. We are the anomaly. Exactly, Vance said softly. The ambush in the Syrian Box Canyon wasn't a navigational error. Echo Actual's GPS was spoofed. Someone at the Pentagon intentionally fed them bad coordinates. They were deliberately walked into a kill box. Why? The word was a razor blade. Because a week before the ambush, Echo Actual raided a safe house in Ramadi. Vance explained, his analytical mind laying out the puzzle pieces. They found a ledger. Hard evidence proving that high-ranking officials in American intelligence were funneling weapons to the very insurgent groups we are supposedly fighting. Using Blackwood Solutions as the middleman, Echo Actual found the money trail. So, the money trail tried to erase them. Valerie stared at the table, her mind racing back to the freezing plateau, the swirling wind, the 1.8-second flight time of the bullet that had saved her brothers. She had thought she was fighting insurgents. She had actually been fighting a hit squad paid for by her own government. They couldn't kill Echo Actual in the valley. Valerie whispered, her fists clenching so hard her knuckles turned bone white. Because of me. Because of us, Vance corrected. And now, Blackwood knows that the ghost of Red Valley isn't a myth. They know you're alive, and they know you and I pulled the trigger. Vance took a slow breath. They aren't just hunting Echo Actual anymore. They're hunting the Wraith. They're hunting me. They're cleaning house to protect a billion-dollar treason operation. Valerie looked out the cafeteria window. The golden autumn leaves were falling gently to the grass. She had built a fragile, beautiful peace here. She was helping broken kids put their minds back together. She had found a way to carry the weight of her black stars. But looking at the encrypted paper on the table, she realized a brutal truth. You can't heal the wounded while the wolves are still circling the hospital. Elias, she said, not looking away from the window. How many men does Blackwood Solutions have on this cleanup roster? Intel suggests a highly specialized hit team of 12 men, Vance said, watching her carefully. Ex-Special Forces. Ruthless. They operate completely off the books. Valerie slowly turned her head back to Vance. The warmth, the empathy, the civilian instructor, it all burned away, leaving nothing but the cold, calculating fury of the deadliest sniper in Marine Corps history. 12, she repeated softly. She reached up and touched the collar of her fleece, right over the spot where the 12 black stars were tattooed on her skin. The ghosts of Red Valley. They sent 12 men to hunt a ghost, Valerie said, a dark, humorless smile touching the corner of her lips. She picked up her coffee cup and took a sip. It didn't taste bitter anymore. It tasted like a promise. Well, Captain Vance, she whispered, let's introduce them to the dark. The tiny green LED on Elias Vance's ultrasonic jammer didn't just turn off. It flashed a violent, rapid red before dying completely. Vance's hand shot out, covering the device. RF spike, he whispered, the blood draining from his face. Someone just blanketed the entire facility with a military-grade signal jammer. Cell networks, Wi-Fi, emergency radios, they're all gone. Valerie Quinn didn't panic. The civilian instructor who had been sipping bitter coffee a moment ago vanished, seamlessly replaced by the apex predator. Her gray eyes darted toward the large panoramic windows of the cafeteria, scanning the autumn tree line. The birds, Valerie said, her voice a flat, deadpan whisper. What? The aspens. The crows just scattered, but there's no wind. Valerie's eyes tracked downward, landing on a dark gray, unmarked utility van parked near the service entrance. Heavy-duty suspension, Reinforced run-flat tires. Tinted glass. That's an assault element. Elias. They didn't wait. They tracked you. Before Vance could even curse his own operational footprint, the cafeteria lights died with a heavy, echoing thump. For 2 seconds, the room was plunged into darkness, punctuated only by the confused murmurs of the veterans and nursing staff. Then, the backup generators kicked in. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered back to life, but they burned with a sickly, dim, emergency yellow hue. "We need a choke point," Valerie commanded, sliding out of the booth. "We have 0 ballistics, no armor. I need a weapon." "The kitchen," Vance said, his tactical mind catching up to her survival instincts. "Only 2 points of entry. Heavy steel prep tables for cover." "Move," she ordered. They didn't run. Running caused panic, and panic in a room full of combat veterans suffering from PTSD would turn the cafeteria into a deadly stampede. They moved with aggressive, calculated speed, weaving through the tables. As they passed the coffee station, Valerie saw him. Miller, the young, double amputee Marine she had been coaching on the rifle range an hour ago. He was sitting in his wheelchair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. The sudden blackout and the flashing emergency lights had triggered a flashback. His eyes were wide, unseeing, trapped back in a burning Humvee in the Middle East. Valerie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handles of his wheelchair. "Miller, stay with me, Marine," Valerie barked, her voice cutting through his psychological fog with the sharp authority of a gunnery sergeant. "We are moving. Keep your head down." Vance kicked open the heavy double-swinging doors of the industrial kitchen, and Valerie shoved the wheelchair through, spinning it behind a massive, stainless steel commercial refrigerator. "Stay right here," she told the trembling kid, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "Do not make a sound." Vance was already adapting to the environment. He grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from a drying rack. It wasn't an M4 carbine, but in the hands of a trained operative, it was a skull-crushing blunt instrument. "Service doors," Vance whispered, pointing to the back of the kitchen. "If they came in the delivery bay, that's their breach point." Valerie scanned the room. Knives, boiling water, blind corners. It was a chaotic environment. But chaos was where the Wraith thrived. She moved silently to the butcher block, sliding a 10-inch, high-carbon steel chef's knife from the magnetic rack. It felt weightless in her hand compared to a sniper rifle, but it was razor-sharp. She pressed her back against the tiled wall beside the service doors, sinking into a crouch, hiding in the blind spot. Vance mirrored her on the opposite side, raising the heavy skillet. Shish-clack. The sound of a suppressed weapon chambering a round echoed from the hallway outside. It was a distinctly metallic, professional sound. These weren't street thugs. These were Blackwood Solutions contractors. A tiny, snake-like fiber optic camera slid under the gap of the swinging doors, panning left and right. Valerie held her breath. She didn't look at the camera lens, she looked at the floor, knowing the infrared sensor would pick up the reflection of human eyes. The camera retracted. 3 seconds later, the doors blew open. They didn't kick the doors, they glided through them. 2 men moving in perfect, overlapping fatal funnel clearance geometry. They wore sterile black tactical gear, no insignia, heavy plate carriers, and panoramic night vision goggles pushed up on their helmets. They carried customized Mk-18 suppressed short-barreled rifles. The lead contractor stepped past the threshold, his muzzle sweeping toward the refrigerators where Miller was hiding. He never saw the ghost. Valerie exploded from the blind spot with terrifying, silent velocity. She didn't swing the knife. Swinging took too long and exposed the ribs. She thrust upward, driving the 10-inch blade perfectly through the vulnerable gap under the contractor's armpit, bypassing the ceramic armor plate and piercing the subclavian artery. The man's eyes went wide. Before he could pull the trigger, Valerie grabbed the hot suppressor of his rifle with her bare left hand, wrenching the barrel toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, Vance stepped out from the opposite side. He didn't hesitate. He swung the cast iron skillet with the brutal, mechanical force of a baseball bat, connecting directly with the side of the second contractor's Kevlar helmet. The hollow crack echoed over the hum of the refrigerators. The impact scrambled the man's equilibrium. sending him crashing into a rack of metal baking sheets in a deafening clatter. Valerie twisted her blade, pulled it free, and ripped the Mk-18 rifle out of the dying first man's hands as he crumpled to the linoleum floor. She didn't check to see if he was dead. She had a gun now. The math had changed. She spun on her heel, dropping to one knee, bringing the acquired Mk-18 to her shoulder. The second contractor was scrambling to his feet, disoriented, trying to bring his weapon up. Fut. Valerie squeezed the trigger, delivering a flawless double tap to the center of his face shield. The man dropped like a stone. Silence rushed back into the industrial kitchen, save for the bubbling of a deep fryer and the frantic, shallow breathing of the young Marine in the wheelchair. Vance stood over the second body, his chest heaving, the cast iron skillet still gripped tightly in his hands. He looked at the two dead mercenaries, then at Valerie. She was checking the magazine of the acquired rifle, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. She stripped the spare magazines from the dead man's tactical rig and tossed two to Vance, followed by the second contractor's rifle. "You good, Captain?" she asked, her voice steady. Vance caught the weapon, his military intelligence training seamlessly integrating with his combat reflexes. He checked the chamber and clicked the safety off. "I'm good, but we just made a lot of noise. The rest of the assault team knows exactly where we are." "Good," Valerie said. She walked over to the young amputee, who was staring at the bodies in wide-eyed horror. "Miller, look at me," she commanded gently. The kid looked up. "I need you to wheel yourself into the walk-in freezer. Lock the deadbolt from the inside. Put on a winter coat from the meat rack and do not come out until you hear my voice. Do you understand?" "Why, yes, Gunny," the kid stammered. He spun his wheels, disappearing into the heavy, insulated freezer door. Valerie turned back to the service hallway. She didn't look like a rehab instructor anymore. She looked like a woman who had just realized the war she tried to leave behind had followed her home. And she was furious. She looked at Elias Vance, the intelligence officer who had just brained a heavily armed mercenary with a frying pan. 12 men, Valerie whispered, her thumb resting lightly on the fire selector switch of the stolen rifle. 2 down, 10 to go. Vance raised his weapon, falling into a tactical stack behind her. "Lead the way, Wraith." They stepped over the bodies and pushed through the double doors, walking out of the kitchen and straight into the dark, echoing hallways of the hospital. The hunt was on. The corridors of the Rocky Mountain Veterans Rehabilitation Center were plunged into a claustrophobic, sickly yellow gloom. The backup generators hummed a low, vibrating bass line beneath the silence of the hospital. It was a place built for healing, designed to offer peace to broken warriors. Tonight, Blackwood Solutions had turned it back into a war zone. Valerie Quinn moved down the linoleum hallway like a shadow detached from its host. The Mk-18 carbine was tucked tightly into her shoulder, her cheek welded to the stock, both eyes open. She didn't walk, she flowed. Every footstep was placed with terrifying precision, rolling from heel to toe to eliminate the squeak of rubber on the polished floor. Right behind her, matching her rhythm step for step, was Captain Elias Vance. He kept his weapon trained on the rear vector, covering their 6 o'clock. His heart was hammering a frantic beat against his ribs, but his mind was ice cold. "Hold," Valerie whispered, raising a single fist. They paused at the edge of the intersection leading to the east wing. Up ahead, the glow of a hardwired nurse's station monitor cut through the dark. Because the base jammers only affected wireless frequencies, the internal Ethernet network was still alive. "Vance, the terminal," Valerie murmured, keeping her optics trained down the hall. Vance slipped out of the stack, sliding behind the circular desk of the nurse's station. He holstered his acquired rifle, his fingers flying across the blood-spattered keyboard. The triage nurse had fled, leaving her station unlocked. He bypassed the medical records database and pulled up the internal CCTV security grid. "I have eyes," Vance whispered, staring at the grainy black and white feeds. The jammer didn't kill the hardlines. "Okay, 10 hostiles left. I've got 4 tangos moving in a diamond formation through the physical therapy gym on the 2nd floor. 3 more are sweeping the administrative offices. The last 3, including the team leader, are nowhere on the grid." They're ghosts too, Valerie said, her eyes narrowing. They know how to find the camera blind spots. What's in the physical therapy gym? Heavy equipment, treadmills, free weights, hydrotherapy tanks, Vance reported. It's a labyrinth of metal and mirrors. Perfect for an ambush. Send the coordinates to my brain, Valerie said, stepping away from the wall. We take the 4 in the gym first. We thin the herd before we go hunting the alpha. They found the stairwell and ascended to the second floor, moving in absolute silence. When they reached the heavy oak doors of the physical therapy ward, Valerie didn't burst through. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the wood. Through the thick door, the muffled, distinctly tactical sounds of heavily armed men coordinating a sweep echoed in the dark. Check the hydro tanks, a gruff voice commanded. Thermal shows latent heat signatures. Someone was just here. Valerie looked at Vance and tapped her head, then pointed to the door hinges. I go high, you go low. Vance nodded. He checked the fire selector on his Mk-18. Semi-auto. In a room full of oxygen tanks and reflective surfaces, full auto spray and pray was a death sentence. Valerie pushed the door open an inch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy steel D-ring carabiner she had snatched from the kitchen storage. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it hard across the dark room. The heavy metal ring clattered loudly against a rack of stainless steel dumbbells in the far corner. Movement. Corner 3, one of the mercenaries barked. All 4 Blackwood contractors snapped their suppressed weapons toward the sound, their night vision goggles blinding them to anything outside of their narrow, green-tinted focal cones. It was the oldest trick in the book, and it bought Valerie exactly 1.5 seconds. She kicked the door wide open and stepped into the fatal funnel. Fut-fut. Her first double tap caught the closest mercenary directly in the side of his Kevlar helmet. The armor-piercing 5.56 mm rounds shattered the composite material, dropping him instantly before he could even register the door opening. Vance slid into the room low. Dropping to one knee, he acquired the second target, a massive contractor swinging his rifle back toward the door. Vance didn't aim for the head, it was too small a target in the dark. He aimed for the pelvic girdle, the one place heavy body armor didn't cover. Fut-fut-fut. The mercenary grunted, his legs collapsing out from under him as his pelvis shattered. He hit the floor hard, his rifle clattering away. Contact front. The third mercenary screamed, diving behind a line of heavy treadmills. He opened fire, the suppressed chatter of his weapon chewing up the drywall right where Valerie had been standing a microsecond before. But Valerie was already gone. She had sprinted laterally the moment she fired her first shots, diving into the shadows of the hydrotherapy pools. She was moving with the terrifying, predatory speed of a woman who had survived for years by being invisible. Vance stayed pinned near the doorway, laying down covering fire to keep the remaining 2 mercenaries suppressed behind the treadmills. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the heavy cast iron exercise equipment. Flank them, Wraith, Vance yelled over the gunfire. Behind the treadmills, the third mercenary popped up to return fire. He never even saw where the shot came from. From atop one of the drained hydro pools, Valerie fired a single, surgical round. It punched straight through the side of the mercenary's neck, bypassing his plate carrier entirely. He fell backward, gargling blood. The fourth and final contractor panicked. His squad had been decimated in less than 10 seconds. He realized he wasn't hunting a terrified veteran, he was locked in a cage with a monster. He abandoned his cover, breaking into a sprint toward the emergency exit at the back of the gym, reaching for the radio on his shoulder to call for backup. Valerie didn't shoot him, she needed intel. She vaulted over the hydro pool, her boots hitting the rubberized floor with a heavy thud. She sprinted after him, closing the distance with terrifying speed. As the mercenary reached for the door handle, Valerie lunged. She slammed the buttstock of her Mk-18 into the back of his knee, buckling his leg. As he dropped, she wrapped her arm around his throat in a brutal rear naked choke, dragging him backward to the floor. She pressed the hot muzzle of her rifle directly against his temple. Call for backup, Valerie whispered into his ear, her voice dripping with venom. And I paint this wall with your brains. The mercenary froze, coughing violently as her forearm crushed his windpipe. Vance jogged up, keeping his weapon trained on the door, securing the perimeter. Valerie eased her grip just enough for the man to breathe. She yanked his night vision goggles off, exposing his terrified, sweat-drenched eyes. "You're Blackwood," Valerie stated coldly. "Who is leading this assault? Where is your commander?" The mercenary spat a glob of blood onto the floor. He looked up at her, a twisted, desperate smirk forming on his lips. You're too late. Wraith, we were just the distraction." Vance's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, distraction?" "The boss, Commander Graves," the mercenary choked out, coughing again. "He doesn't care about the stragglers in the wards. He went straight for the basement. The main breaker room." Valerie's brow furrowed. "Why the breakers?" "He's not here to shoot you, sweetheart." The dying mercenary laughed, a sickening, wet sound. "He brought thermite charges. He's going to melt the foundation pillars and burn this entire facility to the ground. You, the intel officer, the patients, everyone burns. All the evidence turns to ash." Valerie and Vance locked eyes. The rehab center housed over 200 patients. Amputees, sedated psychiatric cases, elderly veterans. If Blackwood set off military-grade thermite in the basement, the building would collapse in minutes, becoming a raging inferno. There would be no survivors. Valerie stood up. She looked down at the mercenary. "Sleep," she said softly. She brought the butt of her rifle down hard, knocking him unconscious. She turned to Vance, the cold calculation in her eyes burning with a new, frantic intensity. The cat-and-mouse game was over. It was a race against the clock. 10 minutes, Valerie said, checking the magazine of her rifle. "If Graves sets those charges, we all die. We have to clear the basement. Now." Vance checked his own weapon, his jaw set in grim determination. He wasn't just an analyst anymore. He was a soldier. "Let's go kill the Alpha," Vance said. They left the gym, sprinting down the dark corridors, racing toward the bowels of the hospital. The shadows were deepening, and the wolves were preparing to light the match. The descent into the sub-basement of the Rocky Mountain Veterans Rehabilitation Center felt like walking into the belly of a mechanical beast. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of machine oil, stagnant water, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The backup generators roared down here, a deafening, vibrating hum that masked the sound of approaching footsteps. Valerie Quinn and Captain Elias Vance moved down the concrete stairwell, their acquired Mk-18 carbines scanning the tight, industrial angles. Thick bundles of PVC piping and heavy steel ventilation shafts crawled along the low ceilings like metallic veins. 3 targets left, including Graves, Vance whispered, his lips practically touching Valerie's ear so she could hear him over the generators. "The primary load-bearing pillars are in the central boiler room. If he's setting thermite, that's where he'll be." Valerie nodded. She checked her magazine. 14 rounds left. It was going to have to be enough. She sliced the pie around the steel doorframe leading into the boiler room. The space was massive, a cavern of rusted metal tanks, hissing steam valves, and flickering, caged utility lights. Through the dense, drifting steam, Valerie saw them. 2 Blackwood contractors were standing guard near the catwalks, their night vision goggles sweeping the shadows. But it was the third man who drew her eye. Commander Graves. He was a hulking mass of advanced tactical gear. Unlike the standard contractors, Graves wore heavy, level 4 ceramic ballistic plates that covered his chest, shoulders, and groin. A ballistic face mask with a skull motif obscured his features, leaving only a pair of dead, calculating eyes visible behind shatterproof polycarbonate lenses. He was meticulously strapping blocky, clay-like bricks of military-grade thermite to the massive steel girders that held up the entire facility. Thick wires ran from the charges to a remote detonator on his tactical vest. "He's wiring the charges in a daisy chain," Vance hissed, analyzing the explosive setup. "If he hits that detonator, the thermite burns at 4,000 degrees. It will melt those steel pillars in 10 seconds. The whole building comes down. Then we don't let him hit the button," Valerie said coldly. She didn't wait for a countdown. She stepped out from the doorway, raised her rifle, and squeezed the trigger. Fut fut fut. Her first burst caught the contractor on the left catwalk. The rounds punched through his chest rig, sending him tumbling over the metal railing to crash onto the concrete floor below. The second contractor spun around, wildly firing his weapon into the steam. Sparks showered the room as bullets ricocheted off the heavy boilers. Vance leaned out from cover, lining up his sights, and fired a controlled pair into the man's center of mass, dropping him instantly. But Commander Graves didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. He didn't panic. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the doorway where his two men had just been slaughtered. He looked at the shadows, his eyes locking onto Valerie's position. Graves raised a heavily modified, fully automatic SCAR-H battle rifle. "Cover!" Valerie screamed, shoving Vance backward into the stairwell just as Graves opened fire. The heavy 7.62mm rounds didn't just hit the concrete doorway, they pulverized it. Chunks of cinder block and rebar exploded inward, raining down on Valerie and Vance. The sheer kinetic force of the weapon was terrifying. The suppression wasn't meant to keep them pinned, it was meant to tear through their cover and shred them. "He's heavily armored and carrying a cannon," Vance yelled over the deafening roar of the SCAR-H. "We can't trade shots with him. We need to flank. He wants us pinned so he can finish the wiring." Valerie yelled back, wiping concrete dust from her eyes. The fire paused as Graves reloaded. "I'm going to draw his fire into the steam vents. You move right. Get a clean angle on his detonator. If you hit the radio receiver on his chest, the charges won't trigger." Before Vance could argue, Valerie broke cover. She sprinted into the boiler room, not toward Graves, but laterally, diving behind a massive, hissing water tank. Graves instantly tracked her movement. His SCAR-H roared again, chewing a line of destruction across the metal tank. High-pressure steam erupted from the bullet holes, filling the center of the room with a blinding, scalding white fog. It was exactly what Valerie wanted. She used the thick steam as a smokescreen, moving with predatory silence. She discarded the Mk-18 carbine, it was empty, and in close-quarters combat against heavy armor, a 5.56mm rifle was just a club. She drew the 10-inch chef's knife she had taken from the kitchen. From the other side of the room, Vance popped up from behind a generator. He raised his rifle, aiming specifically for the bulky detonator strapped to Graves's chest. Vance fired. The round sparked off Graves's heavy chest plate, missing the detonator by an inch. Graves grunted, staggering slightly from the impact. But the level 4 armor absorbed the fatal trauma. He whipped his SCAR-H toward Vance and unleashed a devastating burst. "Arg!" Vance cried out as a 7.62mm round punched clean through his left shoulder, spinning him around and throwing him to the ground. His rifle clattered out of reach. "Captain!" Valerie screamed. Graves began walking slowly toward the wounded intelligence officer, his boots crunching on the spent brass. He raised his rifle to finish the job. "You're a long way from a computer screen, analyst." Graves's voice boomed from behind his ballistic mask, deep and distorted by a voice modulator. He never got to pull the trigger. Through the thick curtain of steam, the wraith struck. Valerie launched herself off the side of a boiler, closing the distance in a blur of motion. She didn't attack his heavily armored chest or back. She went for the joints. She slammed into Graves from the side, driving the heavy steel blade of her knife directly into the narrow, unarmored gap behind his right knee. Graves roared in pain, his leg buckling instantly. The SCAR-H fired wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed to one knee. But the mercenary commander was massive, fueled by combat stims and pure rage. He backhanded Valerie with a brutal, armored fist, sending her crashing into a metal pipe. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She tasted blood. Graves dropped his rifle and drew a heavy, serrated combat knife from his thigh rig. He lunged at her, moving with terrifying speed for a man of his size. Valerie rolled beneath the sweeping blade, feeling the steel graze the fabric of her fleece. She swept his good leg, bringing him crashing down to the concrete alongside her. It devolved into a brutal, primal struggle in the dark, wet belly of the hospital. There was no math here, no windage or elevation. It was just muscle, bone, and the desperate will to survive. Graves pinned Valerie to the floor. his massive hands wrapping around her throat, choking the life out of her. The ballistic skull mask hovered inches from her face, its soulless eyes staring into hers. "You should have stayed dead in the desert." "Wraith," Graves hissed, squeezing harder. "You're a relic. I'm going to burn this building to the ground. And your ashes will mix with the rest of these broken failures." Valerie's vision began to tunnel. Black spots danced at the edges of her sight. Her lungs burned. She reached up, clawing at his armored forearms. But it was like trying to bend solid steel. "Tell her I wish Wraith was here." The voice of Sergeant Major Thomas echoed in her fading consciousness. The memory of the men she had saved. The young amputee hiding in the freezer upstairs. The 12 black stars permanently inked onto her collarbone. She wasn't going to let anyone else die. Not tonight. Not ever again. With the absolute last reserve of strength in her malnourished, battered body, Valerie stopped fighting his hands. Instead, she reached down to her own thigh. When Graves had backhanded her, she had lost her knife. But she hadn't lost her mind. Her hand closed around the heavy, cylindrical object she had unclipped from Vance's tactical belt moments before the breach. A standard issue M84 stun grenade. A flashbang. She pulled the pin. Graves saw the spoon fly off the grenade. His eyes widened behind his polycarbonate mask. "No." Valerie shoved the live flashbang directly into the narrow gap between Graves's chest plate and his tactical vest. Right against his collarbone. She violently bucked her hips, throwing him off balance just enough to roll away, covering her ears and closing her eyes tightly. Bang! The M84 detonated with a blinding flash of 7 million candela and a deafening 170 decibel shockwave. It didn't produce shrapnel, but detonating it at point-blank range inside a man's vest was devastating. The concussive force shattered Graves's ribs and ruptured his eardrums. His ballistic mask cracked under the pressure wave. He was thrown backward, thrashing on the ground in a state of total sensory overload, his nervous system completely short-circuiting. Valerie didn't waste a millisecond. Her ears were ringing, her vision swimming with afterimages of the flash. But she scrambled to her feet. She grabbed Graves's discarded Scar H from the floor. She walked over to the convulsing, blinded mercenary commander. She aimed the heavy barrel of the rifle down at the remote detonator strapped to his chest. She pulled the trigger, firing a single round that smashed the electronic detonator into a shower of plastic and sparks. The thermite charges were dead. The hospital was safe. Valerie stepped back, her chest heaving, the heavy rifle drooping in her exhausted hands. "Val!" A weak voice coughed from the shadows. She dropped the rifle and ran to Elias Vance. The intelligence captain was leaning against a boiler, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale, but he was alive. "You look terrible, Captain," Valerie breathed, dropping to her knees beside him and pressing her hands over his wound to apply pressure. Vance offered a weak, pain-filled smile. "I hit the guy with a frying pan an hour ago. I think my luck just ran out." He looked past her to the broken, defeated form of Commander Graves. "The charges?" "Neutralized," Valerie said softly. "The wolves are dead. Elias, the pack is broken." Vance let his head rest against the cold metal tank, closing his eyes. The vibrating hum of the generators suddenly sounded peaceful. "So," Vance whispered, wincing as Valerie tightened a makeshift tourniquet around his shoulder. "What does the Wraith do now?" Valerie looked up toward the ceiling of the basement, thinking of the hundreds of sleeping veterans in the wards above them. Men and women who had fought, bled, and lost themselves, just like she had. She had spent 3 years hiding in the dark, running from her ghosts. But tonight, she had learned something important. The dark wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to hunt. "I think," Valerie Quinn said, a fierce, protective light returning to her gray eyes, "that it's time to start bringing my people home."